A friend of mine who has a master's from one of the British universities is a strong advocate of the colonialism project that you cannot persuade him otherwise. But is he an exception to the general rule? In this episode, I start by quoting a line from George Orwell, which says, "He who controls the past controls the future. He who controls the present controls the past." At the time when George Orwell wrote these words in 1949, in his novel 1984, which you probably have read, the Berlin Conference in Germany, which took place in 1984 to 1985, had long concluded. That conference was called by Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany, to come and try to resolve some disagreements among European countries that had an interest in Africa. The conference is also known as the Scramble for Africa in our history books. The irony of this acronym is that a continent which was inhabited peacefully by its indigenous populations was a subject of partition by foreign countries that had absolutely no connection or interest in this landmass. The Berlin Conference, as we know it in our history books, as recorded, ends the story at the point where Africa is partitioned into different countries, including my own country, Zambia. The history books seem to end the story there. Many pupils, including myself, when I was at school, have internalized this information and see nothing wrong with that conference. What is wrong with colonizers partitioning a continent which, according to history books, was inhabited by the race of primitive populations who had nothing to their name? The colonizers came and brought civilization to the continent, so my friend argues. And this civilization has ended up in the technology that we enjoy today. And yet, the truth of the matter is that the Berlin Conference of 1884-85 was not only about borders. It was mainly about human and natural resources that were found in those borders. The European countries wanted to have access and possession the natural resources in the respective countries that had been partitioned. Colonization continued, and Britain and France, who were the main participants in African colonization in Africa, the pattern of their colonization was very similar. They came to Africa, they came to my country, Zambia in particular, laid down some infrastructure in form of railways, seaports for countries like Ghana. When they wanted to export the commodities from Africa, they used this infrastructure, which they called development, or we probably call it development now. Where they had railways, they needed railway sidings as loading bays. So looking at my country, Zambia, the sidings ran from up north up to the south. And these are what we call towns today. And this is what we call development brought about by the colonial masters. When the time for independence came, the colonizers of the Francophone countries, France in particular, the Anglophone countries, Britain in this case, did not want to give up these countries. Instead, here is what they did. They prepared constitutions which they handed over to African leaders. In the case of Zambia, at Lancaster House. These constitutions were given to the African leaders without any debate, any consultation, and they were taken as they were. And the African leaders were told, this is what will bring about your independence. And this is what brought about the wave of independent countries in Africa in the 60s, starting with the Sudan in January of 1956. And then the rest followed, with countries like Zimbabwe attaining their independence in 1980 after a long freedom struggle that cost many thousands of lives in that country. At the time when Britain and France were granting independence to African countries, there were two former colonies of Britain that had gained independence before that period. One was the United States in 1776, after the War of Independence in 1775, and the next country was India. In 1947, after India rejected the government of India of 1935, which had been designed by the British to provide a roadmap for Indians' independence. India rejected that act. The two countries, the US and India, formulated their own constitutions. The United States in 1787, after the Philadelphia Conference, and India in 1949, after the Constituent Assembly. These constitutions were formulated by the two countries without the participation or influence of Britain. They decided their future as newly independent countries. This is not what happened to Africa. And we can see from this context the difference in the standing of the two countries in the world. They are industrial powerhouses in their own right. There is no vassal relationship between the United States and Britain as a former colony. There is no such relationship between India and Britain as a former colony. The two countries are not producers of raw material only for export to Britain, unlike the relationship of African countries. In 1945, after the end of the Second World War, Roosevelt and later Harry Truman put a lot of pressure on Britain and France to grant independence to their colonies. Europe had just come out of the Second World War. Europe was weak, both militarily and economically. And Europe owed the United States colossal amounts of money incurred from the costs of the war. And they had to pay that money back to the United States. So America put pressure on them to give up these colonies so that the colonies are out of the orbit and control of these colonial masters, in order to create a new economic world order of trade to enable the Europe that had come out of the war to pay its debts to the United States. So the recorded history, I argue here, that Africa became independent, that Zambia became independent because of the magnanimity of Britain, that Zambia became independent because we waged a strong independence freedom struggle, is not the truth. The catalyst to what we call independence for our country was not the freedom and rights of Africans. It was instead the economic interest of the United States and Europe, which had come out of the war. They needed the raw materials from these countries. They needed to create some semblance of civilized trade in order to develop their metropole cities and develop the United States. So it is therefore a fiction when we get to celebrate our independence on the basis that this is not part of the umbilical cord of the neo-colonial project. It is a myth when our schools continue teaching such history. Isn't it time that we change the narrative and say the truth and have this truth recorded? That from all the colonies of Britain at the time, only 2 are independent. Only the United States and India can be said to be truly independent, and therefore we need to revisit the terminology independence for Zambia, even as we celebrate this event on the 24th of October of every year. We need to start teaching the true and correct history to this generation and future generations to come. When the powers realized that this is the way to go, they had to design another scheme. All the books that are used to date and prescribed in many of our lessons at primary school, at secondary school, have their origins in the educational system which was set up by the colonizers. So in addition to the infrastructure of railways and seaports, the colonizers had to make sure that they set up an educational system that is going to sustain a neo-colonial nation state, granted the guise of independence, which I've just described. Chinua Achebe's literary masterpiece, Things Fall Apart, which was published in 1958, had its manuscript rejected on 2 occasions by a publishing house in the West. Those of you that have read Things Fall Apart, Chinua Achebe, in that literary piece, exposes or maybe explores the ills and contradictions of colonialism in his native Nigeria. The manuscript was rejected twice, not because it contained nothing, but because of the story that it was going to tell. Africa therefore needs to draw a lesson from this. That one of the ways and the main way that Africa is going to tell her story to the world and to future generations is to establish its own publishing houses. UNIP in the government gave a shot at this. They established the Zambia Educational Publishing House, ZEF. Regrettably and unfortunately, ZEF has received just some lip service from succeeding generations of governments in our country, to the extent that its budget is threadbare. It just is enough for its recurrent expenditure only. But publishing houses need writers. It is at this juncture when I challenge our universities that it is time that our universities produced graduates that are not intellectually timid, but those that can stand up for the truth and defend the truth irrespective of the consequences, because truth is truth is truth. So I would like to see, as a citizen, our intellectuals walking away from the zeal that we see in canvassing political issues, to also include in that enthusiasm the exposure of social and economic injustices in our society, and give them the context to enable citizens to understand why events roll out the way they are, why our poor people of this society continue sliding down into poverty, why we still have high indices of inequality, why the majority of the people continue or remain on the fringes of the economy of this country, why their buying power continues to weaken to a point where they can hardly survive. These are issues which challenge the African intellectual. Democracy cannot thrive in poverty. I do not think that the intention of democracy is to deliver poverty to those that participate in that project, which seems to be the case in Africa. Whereas we envy the developed countries, whereas they come to us and lecture to us about democracy, their democracy ideally has not impoverished the people. At least they can afford a meal, or what is normally called in the ordinary parlance 3 square meals in a day. We still have people, since 1991, when Zambia went back to multi-party politics and established the democratic space that we see today, the majority of our people are still going hungry. The majority of our people are still poor. That surely cannot be the intention of democracy, and we can't reduce democracy to only that voting day every 5 years. The men of letters and philosophers of this world have suffered for their ideas. Some of them have been executed because of their ideas. Socrates was executed in his native Greece for what was alleged as his attempt to corrupt the morals of Athenian youths. Galileo was executed after a mockery of a trial for his teachings that, in fact, it was not the sun that went round the earth, but the other way around. That teaching was against the teaching of the establishment. In this part of the world, we have men, and the list is long. But these are Frantz Fanon in Algeria, Steve Biko in South Africa, Walter Rodney, Bob Marley. These are intellectuals, men who were physically killed. They physically lost their lives as mortals, but the ideas live on to inspire future generations. But the intellectual in Africa cannot sit back and live in the comfort zone, because ideas challenge those that are in power. They instill a chill in the spine of power. That has been history as recorded. So Africa must start being conscious and deliberately decide to harness the collective thinkers that it has. There's a collective power in Africa's thinkers, which Africa needs to mobilize. Only then will Africa compete with the world. In the absence of that, Africa will remain behind. Because knowledge is important for development. And knowledge is never given to anybody on a silver platter. The British philosopher Derek Parfit reminds us that we owe a duty to future generations yet unborn. Africa needs a leadership. Zambia needs a leadership that does not cherish the wealth and comfort of the seat of power it occupies, but instead a leadership which has a vision to move this country into the future. Otherwise, it will be recorded as a leadership which consigned future generations to a perilous age. Africa needs a leadership of confident men and women. Africa needs a leadership that must be judged by what it delivers and not the period of power that it exhibits. It is not the length or the period of time that you remain in power that delivers. It is your vision in the shortest possible time that a leader remains in power. And we saw that in leaders like Nelson Mandela. He only did his 5 years. But Mandela left behind a stable society. A society that was almost on the brink of a civil war between the minority white and the majority African. In 2011, during the protests in Egypt, it was the time of Hosni Mubarak, who had been in power in Egypt for over 30 years. I recall watching Hosni Mubarak on television addressing his people. In his defense, it was Mubarak's view that if he left the seat of power, Egypt would plunge into a civil war. He was wrong. He was ousted by public protests, and Egypt did not slide into a civil war. African leaders are good at looking for excuses for overstaying in power in lieu of delivering the goods and services to the poor of the citizens that they govern. I want to recommend the book that I've read regarding the scramble for Africa and the neo-colonial agenda which has lived or continues to live with us. The book is entitled White Malice. It's written by a scholar named Suzanne Williams. And it has a subheading, The CIA and the Neo-Colonization of Africa. The CIA and the Neo-Colonization of Africa. Very interesting piece of scholarly work, and I recommend it to you. Let me end this episode with one of my quotes, that those who try to sanitize and distort history are guilty of their mistakes and the sins past. Those who try to sanitize and distort history are guilty of their mistakes and their sins past. If you've liked this video, please comment and subscribe. Thank you.